Welcome to Recovering Evangelicals, a podcast for people who were once very comfortable in the Christian faith until the 21st century intruded and made it very hard to keep on believing. I'm your host, Luke Jansen.
And I'm Scott Dyer.
Prayer is one of the key elements in almost every world religion. Certainly this is true for Christianity. Anytime one is asked to define what Christians do, or anytime one Christian is checking the pulse of another Christian, the two activities at the top of the list of things to check off are read your Bible and pray, and doing those two things all the time. And yet prayer is also one of the reasons that leads many people to give up their faith, especially those from more evangelical branches of Christianity. So we thought it would be good to do an episode on prayer. Many people will admit that prayer never works for them. I think many more would say the same if they were honest with themselves. There are others, though, who will say that God helps them find parking spots when they go shopping and often answers their prayers. As for me, I have to say that my understanding of prayer, or my perspective on it at least, has changed dramatically over the past 2 or 3 decades. On the one hand, I now find it hard to pray for things because of how it never seemed to make a difference to my circumstances in the past. Words like frustration, impatience, confusion, and disillusionment come to mind. And on the other hand, even if I thought prayer might work, I now don't want to ask because I don't feel I should get my petty wishes for a parking spot and for my headaches to be taken away, or whatever relatively minor sickness or inconvenience or concern is spoiling my day, when God seems to go on to ignore other people who are suffering tremendously and also asking Him for help and apparently being unheard. I even struggle to say a blessing over the food we're about to eat at the dinner table, thanking God for providing it to us, when in fact so many others did the work to put it on the table in front of us, and so many other people in the world are literally starving. These kinds of daily experiences really affect my inclination to pray and affect what I actually say when I do pray, because I still do, but it's changed. Now, what about you, Scott? What has your experience with prayer been for you?
Yeah, well, I'm right there with you, Luke. I taught a series a number of years ago called Prayer, Why Bother? And that's really how I felt, and in some ways some respects still do, because I mean, when you think about it very logically for a second, God knows all our needs far better than we do. Then why bother? We even have verses in the New Testament that talk about how the Spirit prays on our behalf when we don't pray properly, and things of that nature. And so I've really struggled with that over the years, and just the whole logic of prayer, which there isn't really, frankly, a lot of logic to it. That somebody might be in a car accident. They'll say, people prayed for them, and therefore miraculously 3 people were killed in the accident, but I was thrown free and I'm fine. Yeah, that's a hard one to.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know what I mean? You get a lot of that in Christianity and in all religions. I think you get a lot of that
Right.
kind of thinking. We'll talk about that probably a bit later, but that kind of magical thinking. So yeah, I have absolutely struggled with this topic. It's a huge guilt issue, I think, in the Christian church, because we're told constantly that we should be praying, and there are certain people that are held up as these great, giants of prayer and so on. And I've never been there. And when I was briefly for a short time pastoring a small group, it would really, bother me then, because I'm supposed to be a leader here.
Exactly.
And, well, why am I not fervently praying like some do? So anyway, yeah, been a big struggle for me. But like you, I think my thinking on it has definitely developed quite a bit over the years. And I've come to a place where I think I now have a perspective on prayer that's very different from when I started out, and very different from probably, the typical kind of stuff you hear in our circles.
Right.
However, I think it's more in keeping with the biblical witness.
And before we dive into this, I do want to say to the listeners, this episode is going to be a bit like last week's episode when we talked to Dr. Eric Siebert about God-ordained violence and carnage in the Old Testament. Similar in the sense that it might appear to be just, I might be dismantling a core Christian belief, and the perceived motive one might think I have is to just reject this core Christian belief entirely, and maybe even to reject Christian faith itself entirely. But let me say again up front, that's not the case. I want to challenge this particular Christian belief to ask if we've been looking at it all wrong. We can still hang on to it if we can just look at it differently and understand it differently. I also want to explain to our listeners that we pondered for a long time about trying to find an expert on prayer, but we realized pretty quickly that any Christian expert we bring on is going to have to toe the party line of the denomination they attend. Obviously, somebody from a more evangelical background would speak differently than a Roman Catholic, than an Orthodox, than a Jew, for example. So we struggled about trying to find an expert. I'm not sure we wouldn't simply get an idealized response that doesn't live up to what we actually see in our daily life. And I know full well that's going to be true of almost every topic that we tackle, but I think it's especially true of something as fundamental as prayer. So, Scott, if I had to be honest, the main reason that I think this topic is worth a close look is that prayer seems to be expected of all Christians, and yet it seems that prayer just doesn't work, as you just said. And that's perhaps the most common criticism people have about prayer. In a lot of cases, these people are speaking from personal experience. They ask God to give them a job promotion or fix a health problem, their own health or that of a loved one. We all know the kinds of prayers that people tend to offer up, and the general experience is that those prayers just don't seem to work.
Yeah, I think probably the number one reason for disappointment with God, to take the title of one of Phil Yancey's books, is probably unanswered prayer, right?
Right.
Especially unanswered prayer where it was something very dire, a sick child, a sick relative. I've lost a number of friends over the last few years to cancer, and sometimes we really set ourselves up. In one particular case, a very good friend of mine, people surrounded that person and they were sure that they'd heard from God that he was going to be well, and they prayed fervently for that, and very confidently for that, and so on. And he died. And I haven't followed up with those people. I wouldn't do that; it'd be cruel, but in the back of my mind, I think, that must be so disappointing to have felt that. And you must really feel like God is, you've been gypped or something, and
Right.
frankly, I never prayed for that. I was certainly open to it. It would have been fabulous if that had happened, but it was pretty obvious that it was pretty unlikely. My prayers were more
Mm,
along the line of that he would have some peace, that the process would be not painful, things like that, right? I guess what
right.
I would say are more realistic things. And I have friends that would accuse me and say, well, you're just not, you don't have enough faith, you're just not,
Oh, yeah.
oh yeah.
Now, in that story that you told, then it's one thing to pray and to really want it bad enough to the point of believing it because you want it so badly. You said that this person seemed to have they thought they heard somehow from God. What was that?
Yeah, and that's a little bit different than just pure prayer. Yeah, well, this particular person, they had a charismatic leaning, and
Okay.
in that world, people will talk about getting a word of kind
Right.
of almost a prophecy, right? And they felt they had been given this word, and that has happened at least twice in cases that I've been very close to with people with cancer, and in both those cases, that word did not turn out to be true.
Right. So those would be examples of individual prayers, people praying, small groups of people praying for a certain person. That's the personal experience, the anecdotal evidence, but we can also see this failure at the collective level when churches and whole groups of people focus a prayer on one specific thing. A perfect example of this came up not so long ago. It was at the end of last year when Queen Elizabeth died. Years ago, I heard someone say that if prayer really worked, then the Queen should be the healthiest, longest living person on the planet because literally she's had millions of people around the world, from the most ordinary of churchgoers to the highest among the clergy, all of them praying for her every day, asking God to protect her, give her health, and things like that. But the fact is that the Queen's health history was not unlike many other normal, regular people in a wealthy nation who don't have the benefit of such a worldwide daily prayer team. She still got COVID last year and other colds and flus many times in years past. She had gastroenteritis in 2013. Numerous times she's missed public engagements and even been admitted to hospitals for reasons that were not disclosed, other than to say that she had, quote, health concerns. She had a broken wrist in 1994 falling off her horse, a knee operation in 2003, and a back injury in 2021. And her recovery from those injuries and sicknesses was really not any quicker or more dramatic or more mysterious than has been the case for anyone else who's had the same kind of health concerns. Really, she experienced nothing different from what most people who come from a relatively wealthy, sheltered lifestyle have experienced.
And I guess there are certain things in life that are, we call them the great levelers, and of course death being one of them. And we know that it's just a fact that We are all going to die. And no matter how much prayer is offered on our behalf, it's not going to stop that.
Now, Scott, sorry to interrupt you, but
Yeah.
some might say that still she did live a relatively long time, almost a full century. But long life is a characteristic in some family lines, especially if they're wealthy enough to afford a good diet and have access to the best of modern medicine, not to mention that they're living in a safe, quiet little part of the world that's not frequently being torn apart by war or famine or pestilence. And that trait of having many long lived family relatives is indeed true of Queen Elizabeth's family line. Her own mother lived much longer than she did. Queen Elizabeth II lived to be 96 and a half, but her mother lived to be just short of 102. One could say that the Queen Mother was also prayed for by people all around the world, but they had other people in the family who I'm fairly sure were not being prayed for by the rest of the world, but were all indeed beneficiaries of a very wealthy, privileged, and protected lifestyle. Queen Elizabeth II had an aunt through marriage, so outside the bloodline, Princess Alice, Duchess of Gloucester, who lived to be just short of 103. In fact, if you do a quick search in Google for how many people in Britain live to be at least 100 years old, it turns out to be a touch over 1%, according to their governmental department that manages a national pension plan. Take a random group of 100 people in Britain, at least one of them will live to be over 100 years old. Now, here's a kicker. That's true if you're a female, it's 1.1%. But if you're a male, it's only 0.3%.
Very interesting. And what you're hitting at there, too, I think, is if you look at prayer from a scientific point of view, and I think you're going to talk about that in a second in the Harvard situation, it does fall apart pretty quickly because you can demonstrate that statistically there's just nothing extraordinary. If you have a control group, the issue of praying or not praying doesn't seem to have an impact at that kind of scientific level. So you get a lot of people talking anecdotally, like you're mentioning the royal family.
Right.
There's so many things that seem to be intuitively correct until you start to dig in a little bit. And I think, that's where science kind of comes into things a lot of times, where there's a lot of things in the world that we live in that on the surface look a certain way. And then when we dig into them, they turn out to be very, very different. I was just listening recently to Neil deGrasse Tyson. He's no friend of religion, of course, but I enjoy listening to him. And he talked about the tides and something that I never knew, but we experience the tides as something like I live in Victoria here, so tides are a big part of life here, and we experience those tides as water moving in toward us and then moving out. That's how we experience them, and our language reflects that and everything. Well, he explains something that I never knew. That's not what's going on at all. That there's actually a bulge in the ocean, and it's
Right.
the Earth's rotation that causes us to move into that bulge and out of that bulge.
Yeah.
It's not that the water is coming to us; it's that we're coming to
Right.
the water. Yeah,
Yeah.
I never knew that, and I just thought that was fascinating. So there you have a classic example of something that phenomenologically looks a certain way, but when you dig into it, you realize it's really not happening the way we think it's happening. And I think in relation to prayer, I think that's what happens a lot. When you hear Christians talk about prayer, there's a lot of anecdotal stuff. But if you scratch much below the surface, you discover that, wow, it doesn't stand up so much, And
Right.
so in my case, in my social circles, because for whatever reason, they tend to be more conservative, I don't scratch below the surface. If that gives them some peace and so on, why am I going to disturb that? But
Sure.
but we're talking to people, in our podcast who do think about these things more, at a deeper level, and they're not satisfied by that, and neither, frankly, am I.
So, Scott, you made a reference to the Harvard prayer experiment. Do you
Yeah,
know that study? Could you explain that, or?
sure. Yeah, I mean, I'm not intimately familiar with it, but basically they subjected prayer to science, I guess you could say. They
Yep.
had a randomized study. They controlled for placebos. It was a double-blind study. And for our listeners who may not be aware, a double-blind simply means that the person administering the study also doesn't know that they're part of the study. So bias can't be introduced, at any level. And that's kind of the gold standard in a study. There were 3 patient groups in the study, and what they discovered was that there was no significant statistical difference in outcomes between any of the groups that prayed, the groups that didn't pray, and so on. And so from a scientific point of view, in that particular study, you couldn't scientifically say prayer had made a difference. Now, I know one of the criticisms of that from a conservative point of view would be, well, God doesn't subject himself to scientific studies. So he just purposely backed off because he knew what they were up to. What can you do with that? I mean, if
Yeah, see, the thing is, you're quoting people referring to a verse that's in there that is not being applied correctly. So that verse is basically you can't test the Lord your
right,
God, that kind of thing. Well, this isn't testing God. This is testing the efficacy of prayer.
yeah,
And it doesn't say that when you do try to test God, then he's going to do something different. It doesn't
right.
say that.
And even if you don't have the Harvard study, if you look at just a situation like we went through recently the last few years with COVID hit everybody. In fact, some of the most outspoken faith healers died from COVID. They refused to take
Yeah,
precautions and they died.
I know.
So what does that say, right? It's pretty
Right.
pretty obvious to me what it says. Yeah.
Now, I want to give some background on that Harvard prayer experiment because I
Yeah.
think some of the background details are important. It was set up as a double blinded, randomized, controlled study, and that's the gold standard for doing scientific studies. It was done by a researcher at Harvard University, so not just some small fundamentalist Bible college. And the PI, the principal investigator on that study, was a believer himself,
Hmm.
cardiologist Herbert Benson and his colleagues. And it had funding from Templeton Foundation, who, as we all know, it's interested in exploring the interactions between faith and science. And I don't know that all the listeners are going to know what you were saying there about double blinded and the placebo. So let's talk a little bit about that. I think people should know these things. I think most do, but there may be some who aren't exactly clear. So, what medical studies often will do is they'll split the test subjects into two groups. And Scott, you mentioned three. I'll get back to that in a moment. But usually, what they'll do is they'll split them up into two groups, the ones who got the medicine and the ones who didn't. And everything else about what these test subjects go through in the two groups is identical. The only difference is whether the pill that they take is the drug or not, or the procedure that's done is actually done or not. So they'll even do a placebo-controlled study with a surgical procedure. They'll open the person up, cut them open, expose the organ, it out of the body, for example, and then just put it right back and close it all up. That's the sham operation versus the one that's actually done. And that's how they'll compare whether these things, these procedures or the drugs that are being given are actually due to the procedure and the drug and not because the patient thinks they're getting something. There is a psychological benefit that these patients can get from just being in the study. They feel like they're being taken care of by a really highly qualified doctor. It's a prestigious hospital and they've got caring, compassionate, and educated nurses around them. So all of that has a very calming and a beneficial effect. And that alone might be the reason why the procedure has an effect, just because you feel more calm and safe and secure. So that's what we call placebo control. And so then let's talk about the blinding. We often will refer to a double blinded study. The test subjects aren't told that they get the drug, and so they're blinded. They don't know that they're receiving the drug or not. They're blinded to that fact. But they will also blind the doctors who are treating them so that the doctors don't give preferential treatment to one group over the other. There's many reasons why the doctors might do that. They may really believe the drug works and they want the study to show that the drug works, maybe because they have a patent on the drug and want to make money, or it's out of compassion. They believe that the procedure works and they want to treat the really sick patients. So they'll put the really sick ones in the test group and the not so sick ones in the control group. So that's where the blinding needs to be done for both the doctor and the test subjects. And then lastly, to really make sure that no one knows who's getting the drug, the test subjects are randomized. They basically roll the dice to see who goes to the left side of the room and who goes to the right side. And so that's what we call a randomized, double blinded, placebo controlled study. And now for this Harvard prayer experiment. They looked at almost 2,000 patients who were getting a particular coronary bypass operation, a fairly standard operation for a very standard kind of patient where the procedure is identical for everyone. And there's a standard set of complications. This is the important part. When you get a coronary bypass operation, there's a standard set of complications that frequently come up, for which prayer presumably is meant to have an effect. I mean, how often don't people, when they're praying for the loved one going into an operation, how often don't they say, please God, guide the surgeon's hands, make sure everything goes right, make sure that there won't be any complications and that so and so will see a full and complete recovery. That's a common prayer that people make when people go into these kinds of surgeries. So let's now talk about the three groups that you mentioned, Scott, that Dr. Benson and his colleagues randomized the patients into. Two of those groups had similar numbers of people in both groups. Two of them were all told that they might be prayed for or they might not be prayed for. So they were blinded to whether they got, quote unquote, the drug or not. And the surgeons doing the operation also didn't know who was going into which group But one of those two groups did get prayed for and one group did not. So that's the double-blinded, randomized, placebo-controlled study. And then to further get into whether there was possibly a placebo effect, that maybe part of the efficacy of prayer might be in how a person receives the prayers, they had a third group of patients who were told they would be prayed for, and they were prayed for. So I'm hoping the listeners can visualize those three groups. Two didn't know if they were or not. They might have been prayed for, they might not. And then the third group who were told that you will be, and they were. And the bottom line is, as Scott said, that there really was not a difference. I think the numbers actually showed that there was a slightly less good outcome of having been prayed for, but it didn't reach statistical significance. So what do you
Yeah.
do with that?
Yeah. What do you do with that? What I think that really undermines is the concept of quid pro quo type prayer, which is what a lot of prayer is, right? That if I pray, somehow the outcome will be what I pray for. It really undermines that. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't. We'll talk about this more, but prayer can't or shouldn't be reduced only to that. If that's all the prayer is, then I think you would have to conclude that prayer is certainly not efficacious.
Right.
However, I don't think even the biblical evidence supports that idea. I think the biblical evidence seems to support that we're asked to pray for things, but with no guarantees that we're going to get the outcome that we would like for those prayers.
Mm-hmm.
And not only that, but in the most famous Christian prayer, the Lord's Prayer, where Jesus said that he's teaching us how to pray, not what to pray, but how to go about praying. It's interesting that in that, there's only one part of that, give us this day our daily bread, that is praying specifically for an outcome, for something to happen, that we'll eat. The rest of it is all around, worship and Christian behavior, that we not be led into temptation, things along those lines. So even in the model of prayer that Jesus gives, the emphasis is not on getting things, and specifically asking for things, which I think is very interesting, because compared to if you look at the prayer life of most religious people, from what I experienced, at least 80-90% of it is asking for very specific things.
I'm not prepared for this one because I didn't know that you were going to say that, Scott. But that reference to in the Lord's Prayer, give us our daily bread, I forgot the details, but I do remember hearing somebody speaking about how that was a reference to an Old Testament passage where they were basically asking God for their daily bread, lest they be tempted to do something wrong, like stealing from somebody else. So it comes from Proverbs 30, verses 8 and 9, where it says, "Give me neither poverty nor riches, but give me only my daily bread. Otherwise I may have too much and disown you, or I may become poor and steal, and so dishonor the name of my God."
Okay.
So again, there's that temptation. That part of the prayer was about, please don't put me in a position where I'm tempted to steal, even to feed my baby, kind of thing.
Right. Okay.
So,
yeah.
But I do also want to come back to that, what we were saying about 5 or 10 minutes ago about these people who will say, well, you can't put God to the test. So getting back to this Harvard prayer experiment, I said, what do we do with that? Do we really want to say that, well, because God says, okay, now that you're looking, those three groups, they're on their own. I'm not going to help those guys out because you guys are looking.
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
Such a silly response.
So if you want to be healed, let's say, don't participate in a prayer study. You can guarantee that you will not be healed if you do.
Yeah.
Yeah, you end up with these kind of ridiculous arguments.
Right.
Yeah.
And now let's go in the opposite direction. We just talked about examples where prayer doesn't work. Let's talk about people who say absolutely, they're 100% convinced that prayer does work, especially when it comes to medical problems. And so obviously I'm talking about faith healers and faith healings. Earlier in my own faith journey, I spent about 10 or 20 years in circles that fully believed in that stuff. I've been to dozens of faith healing meetings, large and small, and I've seen many more on TV, and I've heard countless third-hand stories. How about you, Scott? What have you seen in this respect?
Yeah, I mean, personally, I haven't participated a lot in faith healing services, although I have a little bit of experience with that, but not extensive. I didn't spend a lot of time in Pentecostal or charismatic circles, but just in the circles that I have been in, there's been a strong emphasis on praying for the sick, praying for healing and things like that. So I would say that, like, I'll just think back to the last time I prayed with a group, which was yesterday, and it was pretty much all about healing in one form or another. So that is certainly a high priority.
Well, praying for a health concern can be a high priority without the attitude
That's
of
true.
being 100% certain this is going to happen. God is going
Yeah.
to heal you. It's going to
Yes.
happen right here and now.
Yeah.
And that's what
Yeah.
we're
No,
talking
you're
about
right.
now.
Yeah. Yeah. No, you're right.
So,
That's a key differentiator for sure.
yeah. Now, I kid you not, I would say that I've witnessed hundreds, if not thousands, of claims of healing miracles in all these services, tremendous claims of healing. Lots of times it's things like chronic headaches and body pains. And I've often seen and heard lots of claims of things like cancers and blindness, deafness, arthritis, you name it. And here's the thing. Here's two things, actually. First, the medical evidence for these healings is either completely absent or not at all convincing. I'm referring to these services I've been in where thousands and thousands of people from churches far and wide, you have no idea who's up on the stage saying that they have this cancer.
Yeah.
What I mean is, they may not have seen a proper medical expert. Maybe they just saw their
Right.
family doc or a family member who's in some unrelated segment of the relevant medical field. Maybe they saw no one at all. They just think that they have cancer because of some abdominal pain, when in fact, what they have is an ulcer or a kidney stone. So you don't know if they have the cancer and you don't know if they're healed, but on the stage, they are suddenly healed and they proclaim this fact. So there's no evidence for the disease, let alone the healing. And second, this is a really important one. This is one that bothers me more. There's certain kinds of healings that are never reported. No amputees ever have their missing arm or leg restored.
Mm.
No one with a congenital physical abnormality, whether that be a cleft palate or Down syndrome or cerebral palsy, no one with a simple and straightforward, easily verified genetic disease like cystic fibrosis or sickle cell anemia, blue-green color blindness, or there are diseases that have a very devastating enzyme deficiency of one kind that can lead to death. Those are never on that stage. The only kinds of healings that are claimed are the ones that do sometimes resolve completely on their own. I'm thinking even cancers. Cancers do sometimes resolve on their own in situations where the people are not praying, they're not believers, and yet there are cancers that resolve. Ulcers can resolve, arthritis can resolve or flare up and go away. So those are the kinds of things that you'll always see in these prayer meetings, the arthritis, the cancers, and the ulcers, but not a missing limb. It just doesn't happen.
Yeah, even something like even blind, the blind receiving sight. I've certainly never either witnessed or even seen a verified case of that.
So I've seen that on stage. And here's the thing. What they'll do
Oh,
is these are people who really don't have good eyesight. They're suddenly put in a position where this person is restoring their sight. And then they'll hold up two fingers. They'll say, how many fingers am I holding up? But they're right in front of the person. They're holding up
yeah,
their hands in front of a dark shirt,
yeah,
like they might be wearing a dark suit or something. And
yeah.
suddenly, because the person can see two fingers instead of three, now their sight is restored. But
Right,
you do an eye test on them, they don't have normal vision at
right,
all.
right.
And I don't know why God would allow them to see a little bit better, just a little bit
Yeah,
better. Why does God help them see 13% instead of 100%,
yeah,
you know?
sure. Yeah,
So
exactly.
that's the kind of thing that I have seen.
Right.
The other most frequent kind of healing seems to be something related to pain, headaches,
Yes,
backaches, sore knees, difficulty walking, basically any kind of pain or discomfort. Lots of reported healings focus on that. But we know the pain can be temporarily ignored or suppressed. We have built in painkillers, adrenaline, and opiates that your body can synthesize under the right circumstances to help you ignore the pain while you focus on more important things. That's why you'll hear stories of someone in a plane crash helping other people escape from the wreckage, sometimes even carrying unconscious people or babies. And then they find out later that their femur was shattered or the ankle is broken, and yet they were walking on that shattered femur or a broken ankle. And they're oblivious to the pain in the moment. And
sure.
that's one of the side effects of the fight or flight response we have built in.
Yeah, I mean, pain is such a mysterious phenomenon, and we know scientifically that pain is created in our brains. It doesn't,
Exactly.
in a certain sense, pain doesn't exist, really.
Right? Yeah.
It's just the brain creates it for good evolutionary reasons, survival reasons. But the brain can also turn it off, like you said,
Exactly.
given the circumstances, right? And if it's
Yeah.
more important to save your life to not feel the pain, the brain can do that.
And so those are examples, or at least the ones that I was referring to, are life and death situations where you can ignore really tremendous pain. You literally ignore it and you do things that you would never be able to do
Right.
when you weren't in that fight or flight situation. But here's the thing, that adrenaline surge and that opiate rush can be triggered in a healing service too.
Mm.
When you're up on a stage in front of people, hundreds, thousands of people, and you're being told to do things that you'd otherwise find painful or uncomfortable to do, and the endorphins kick in, the stress hormones, and you do it, and everyone thinks you've been healed.
Yeah.
I've seen that. And then 2 days later, there's that pain again, sometimes
Yeah.
even worse because of the stunt that you pulled on stage.
Yeah, and sometimes I've seen broadcasts of those kind of services. You can see the person's face. They're still experiencing pain. You can tell. Even
Right,
though they're saying they're not experiencing pain, you can almost see that inner struggle in the way they look, that they're playing along,
right.
because they're in front of all these people, they're excited, they want to be not experience it. And like you said, maybe they aren't. Maybe there are cases where they're really not experiencing it temporarily for those reasons.
Right.
Yeah.
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 And I said that I've witnessed these services where these healings are claimed, hundreds, if not thousands, of these claims.
Yeah.
And those are the kinds of healings that are always the ones that are claimed, the ones that you
Hmm.
can't confirm,
Right.
neither the disease to begin with nor the claimed healing afterwards, and the ones that are known to sometimes reverse by themselves, and the ones that involve pain and discomfort. Those are the ones that are reported. And we have lots of good scientific explanations for those kinds of healings. But there's no theological explanation for why God can't or doesn't restore an amputee.
Mm.
Why not give the guy back 2 legs that he lost to the landmine in Afghanistan, or fix somebody's genome? How hard could that be for God? Apparently, God
Right.
doesn't do those. Please indulge me for a moment while I pitch a proposal to you, the audience. If you're enjoying these episodes, and the fact that you're this far into the episode suggests to me that you do, then I'd like to ask for something in return. No, not your money, but your support nonetheless. What we ask is that you help our podcast by leaving likes and comments at our Facebook pages and website to increase traffic to our site. And even better, share this with one or more of your friends who you know are also wrestling with faith issues and their evangelical roots. Such a small effort on your part could easily double our audience. I hope you agree that this is worth promoting. And now, back to the episode. Okay, so we've dwelt on this one. Let's move on to another myth. I call these myths or misunderstandings about prayer, but there are a couple other myths that I want to talk about. There's the myth or the thinking that greater numbers multiply the efficacy of prayer. It's all a numbers game. And what do I mean by that? Sometimes what you need to do is to pray over and over and over and over and over again, every night, many times all day, to eventually convince God to give you what you're asking for. The thinking being that, if you say it 1,000 times, then God can't ignore you, right?
Yes. I've been given that advice. I remember many years ago, I have an anxiety disorder, which wasn't really properly diagnosed or handled until I was in my 40s. And unfortunately, part of the reason for that was the church, because I was told constantly, it's just a lack of faith and so on and so on and so forth. And I remember one time a fellow saying to me, just say Jesus over and over again at night. Just go, Jesus, 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 Jesus. Just keep doing that, like chant. And I tried doing that. And frankly, sure, it distracts you temporarily. That might work. It does distract you. But as soon as you stop doing it, then everything's just right back to what it was,
Right.
And so it can be very damaging, that
Yeah,
kind of.
exactly. So it is a numbers game in that respect. It's also a numbers game in the sense of people trying to get other people involved. I'll see people, they'll tell their Facebook friends that they have a medical emergency of some kind, a car accident or a loved one needing an operation, something like that. And they're asking as many Facebook friends as possible to, quote, be in prayer about this.
Right.
Again, the thinking being that if 1,000 people are praying about it, then surely God has to follow through. Again, this whole strength in numbers, it's a numbers game. And there's other versions of the same thing. People setting up prayer chains or around the clock prayer vigils. It's all the same idea. The idea that God is too tired or too busy, or he's testing our resolve.
Yeah.
There's a certain threshold. Once enough prayers have been said or enough people are involved in the prayer exercise, that's when God will finally do something about it.
Yes.
And that would be the threshold where we're forcing God to comply with our wishes.
Yeah. This is where the intersection, prayer really demonstrates kind of the intersection between superstition and religion, right?
Yeah.
How closely those two things can be blurred kind of into each other.
Yeah.
And when I'm in Christian circles, listening to people talk, I often think really what they're talking about is superstition. And I think this is a good example of that, where the superstition is that we can kind of manipulate God.
Right.
The fact is we're in this world and we don't have much control over it. So a lot of prayer can be an effort, and that's what superstition is.
Right.
Superstition is an attempt to control the gods, right? Through magical thinking, through things that we do, right? So if I do this, this, and this, and I do it in this order and so on, somehow that will control my situation. And prayer can very quickly become that. And I think this is an example of that, where if I get enough people to pray, somehow that will twist God's arm into
Yeah.
dealing with the situation the way I would like it to be
Yeah.
dealt with. And I'm not arguing here, by the way, that group prayer isn't a good thing, or that asking many people to pray isn't a good thing, because it can have other effects that I think are beneficial. It's nice to, for example, if somebody's hurting, there's a benefit to them knowing that people are thinking and praying for them, that can help them in their own hurt, but not because that's going to somehow magically make God do something that he otherwise wouldn't have done, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
There's one other thing that people will do, not just in numbers, trying to get lots of people on board, especially the mythical prayer warrior. A lot of churches have their prayer warrior, the little old lady who everyone seems to want to be praying for them because she's the prayer warrior. But there is something else that I do see, I do witness, not see in my church. Let me be very clear. This is not my church, but certainly my past, the churches I went to in the past. It's a detestable idea, really, this idea that they work with the idea that you can guarantee your results by paying for it. I've seen it happen many times in circles where you have this prosperity gospel mentality, faith healers and church leaders telling people that God will honor their donations, the money that you send in order to see results. And they'll talk about those donations being like an investment, or they'll talk about it, sowing seeds that will produce a harvest, or the proverb about casting bread in the water. They'll quote the saying that Jesus said, "Give and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over will be poured into your lap." And here's the thing, for with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. And so the idea being there that the more you give, the bigger miracle you'll get,
Yes.
which was not the point Jesus was getting at there.
For sure. And it's really sad that typically those types of ministries really prey on the most desperate people, right?
Exactly.
The people who can least afford. I mean, where is the prosperity gospel most popular? Africa and Latin America.
Right.
In those poor countries. I mean, I've seen pictures in National Geographic of a church with a gold throne.
Yeah.
Worth probably hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Right.
And these poor folks who barely have enough to eat, don't have clean water in many cases, all these kinds of things. And the little that they have is being poured into this scam. And it really is a scam. And it's a horrible exploitation of people.
Yeah. And so that's one thing that related to prayer that I find detestable. There is another one, but I think actually, Scott, you mentioned it earlier in the podcast, which is basically this myth that basically if you don't get what you ask for in prayer, then it must have been God's will. If your child died in a horrible way, despite your many fervent prayers, or maybe your spouse did divorce you, or you did lose your job and all your savings, if that happened, then it must have been God's will. He's got something better in mind. And apparently you're just not seeing the bigger picture. I think that too is a distortion, a deception.
Yeah, I think so too. Because, well, I guess the dilemma, if somebody fervently prays for an outcome, like with regard to maybe a sick child or a loved one of some fashion, and it doesn't happen, then they're kind of impaled on the horns of a dilemma. They're left with that either God really doesn't care, or what you said, that he has some greater purpose, some greater will. Well, if you're impaled on the horns of that dilemma and you're a believing person, which horn are you going to choose, right?
Right.
Because
Yeah.
otherwise you're going to have to deny God. So you've put yourself in a situation right at the outset that's going to leave you with some pretty poor alternatives.
Okay, Scott, we've been really beating up on this idea of prayer. And, in a way I'm intended to, but again, my goal is to see if we can find a new way to understand prayer. Let's face it, the Bible does talk about prayer, that we need to be in prayer. You made reference to that at the very beginning of the episode. There are verses that seem to guarantee results if you just pray about it. And I'm curious what we do about these. So the one that I thought we talk about, because there are many and we don't have time to do them all, but you've got this passage in James, who was, by the way, the brother of Jesus and later the leader of the early apostolic church in Jerusalem. He writes in his letter, or the book of James, "Is any among you sick? Let him call for the elders of the church and let them pray over him, anointing him with the oil in the name of the Lord. And the prayer of faith will save the sick man, and the Lord will raise him up." And I got to say, what do you do with that when it's just not true? It's been tried all through church history. And there are no reports of this being the norm in the early Christian church. So what do we do with that, Scott?
Yeah, well, I think there's a couple of possibilities. One would be interpretively, and I'm not just put this out there, that some may interpret that less literally in a sense, that the prayer of faith will save the sick man. Well, in what sense? Physically? He doesn't say specifically physically. Maybe he's saving him in some other way. Maybe there's a spiritual aspect to this. Maybe he's saving them and giving him peace. The Lord will raise him up. Well, when? Because often that terminology, the Lord will raise him up, it is used eschatologically in the New Testament. He will raise him up on the last day, right?
Yeah.
So I'm just saying that there's some interpretive play that could be happening there, but frankly, I take it more or less at face value. But the thing with biblical statements is we have a tendency to make absolutes out of them. But the fact that we have all these books in the Bible, I believe, is because the Bible is a conversation. And in many respects, there are countervailing. In other words, much of the time this may happen, but other times this may happen. You especially get that in the wisdom literature. In Proverbs, for example, you'll get all kinds of contradictory statements because they're not meant to be taken as absolute statements. So I do think in the case of James here, that he's not necessarily saying here that this is a guarantee that every time a person will be healed and so on, but we're taking it that way.
Right.
He's just saying, do this. This is a good thing to do. And in some cases, there may be actual physical healing. In other cases, but I really don't believe that if you talk to James, that James would say, yeah, what I meant was if you do this, it's tit for tat, it's quid pro quo.
Right.
That person I highly doubt that, right? Just given other things that James says and other things that the New Testament says. So this is a case of proof texting, in my opinion, where you're pulling out verses to justify a position without looking at the whole thing in the context of all of Scripture. I mean, some of the things that people believe about prayer don't come out of nowhere, right? There are biblical passages and things that can lead somebody down a certain path.
Right.
But there are also many other kind of counter, right? So what you have in the Bible is more of a conversation. You can't pluck out a verse and make it a hard and fast absolute, and that's what we often do. And I think that's what's happening in the case of, we can talk about in the case of James. I don't know if James is saying that this is guaranteed to happen every time, right? Jesus' own prayer, he said, if it would be your will, if there's any other way for this to happen, he didn't want to go to the cross, he didn't want to suffer, but he accepted the fact that the answer to that was no. So there's a certain sense in which you could say even Jesus himself he got an answer, but it wasn't the answer he wanted. and I think, in a certain ways, there's an analogy with our own children. Our children come to us with all kinds of requests. We don't grant them all, right? Because we know what's best for our children. We have too many examples in the Bible itself of unanswered prayer, right? Including in Paul's ministry. What do you do with that?
And I was going to say, there are examples of Paul. This is why I say this was not the norm in the early Christian church, because you do have Paul. He's writing to Timothy, and he says to Timothy, stop drinking only water, but use a little wine because of your stomach and your frequent illnesses. Paul doesn't say anything at all about, prayer for that. In his second letter to Timothy, when he's passing, how those letters end off, and he says, say hi to so-and-so and this guy, and, this is happening to another person. He mentions a guy named Trophimus, and he said, whom I left ill in Miletus. So no mention of Paul praying over this guy before he left. He just said, hey, I left him there. He was sick when I left. Hopefully he's still alive.
Right.
And, Paul boasting about the starving and suffering and all kinds of abuse that he suffered, and never mentions about, praying against it and getting results.
Right.
So,
and of course, the famous thorn in the flesh, right? That Paul talks about.
Exactly.
What seems to be a physical ailment that he himself had and was not removed, right? Even though he asked for it to be removed. So if you read the New Testament in particular in context, I don't think you get this idea that prayer is quid pro quo, or that prayer's efficacy or the reason for prayer is mainly about getting stuff. I think you find quite the opposite. That if you limit prayer mostly to that, I think these criticisms that we have laid out here, and there are many others, really undermine that understanding. Yeah.
So just to put a bow on this, that's where I had felt where I am about prayer. Why do I bother praying? It just doesn't seem to work. And I think a lot of other people are in the same boat. They just say, you know what, this is why I give up in Christian faith. We're supposed to do this and it doesn't work and there's nothing to it. What they'll also sometimes do is they'll talk about prayer. They'll say, look, you're not talking to God. You're not talking to some God up in heaven. You're talking to yourself. You're actually speaking to yourself. It's no different from private meditation. You're pulling together your cognitive abilities to solve the problem. You're telling your brain, solve this problem, try to figure it out. And
Right.
they'll also compare prayer to things. There's this phenomenon of speaking good things into the universe. They call it the
Mm,
law of attraction. It was a book written by Rhonda Byrne called The Secret, and it sold something like 30 million copies worldwide. I heard it was
yeah.
translated into 50 languages. So that's the idea that these people are saying this is no different from that.
Well, you know what? I think there's some truth to that. I think one reason for prayer may be that it is self-talk. When we pray,
Exactly.
and that can be healthy. That can be a good thing, and it may very well be that God wants us to pray because that is a good thing to do. To that self-talk and reinforcing certain things, certain beliefs, and certain understandings, and so on. That we know for a fact now through biology that our circuitry is greatly determined by our thinking patterns, right? I mean, the whole basis of cognitive behavioral therapy is to think differently, right?
Yep.
So prayer could be a major factor in learning to think about things differently, right?
Right.
And so, so I don't have a problem with that. I don't have a problem with prayer being self-talk in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And that's where I want to take this episode to finally put a bow on this.
Right.
We've been bashing prayer and how it doesn't work, but I have hinted that maybe there is something to prayer, and this is exactly where I'm going with this idea. Maybe prayer does work, but not as a vending machine, not
Mm,
to get stuff and not to somehow trick your brain into believing you got stuff and that sort of
right.
thing. But maybe it's a discipline that's intended to change yourself, not change God, not make God do stuff for you, but maybe to change yourself.
Yes.
And I've often said, instead of praying, God, please do something about those people suffering over there, some disaster on the other side of the world, maybe God wants you to do something about that suffering. And maybe the
Yes.
answer to that, the solution, the what that you have to do, comes to you through meditation and introspection in prayer.
Absolutely.
Instead of asking God to make a decision for you, to show you a sign that you can act on, maybe God wants you to use your own head and to do some serious introspection, learn about yourself, and grow up, basically.
Yeah. Just along the lines of what you're saying, I couldn't agree more. And you remind me of a quote I heard from the current Pope, Francis. He said, "Pray that the poor will be fed, then feed them. That's how prayer works."
Exactly.
and I
Exactly.
and I think that's bang on. And so when we pray for the Ukraine, it puts it in front of our minds, and then we think, okay, well, now what can we do about the Ukraine? How can we write our representatives? Can we, it's that communal awareness. Hopefully, will result in action,
Right.
and I think that's a key feature of
Yeah.
prayer. Yeah.
So communal awareness is what you referred to, but there's also this idea of just being introspective, to actually prayers about tuning into yourself and basically trying to figure out what role you are supposed to play. And that introspection and that empathic suffering, that needs to be marinated in a growing awareness of your connection to God, what He wants done in the world.
Yes.
One of our listeners, Stephen, made a similar comment in our private discussion group. He wanted an episode on prayer because, and this is now Stephen talking or writing, he wrote, partly, I guess, to help me always and forever to escape from any simple sense of it doesn't work because I ask for things and don't get them, rather than reflective listening to God that eventually opens my stubborn mind to see that what I thought I was asking for would not, in fact, bring about on earth God's will as it is in heaven. So same idea, that prayer is about that
Yeah.
introspective thought and looking for what role you yourself are supposed to play.
I mean, to me, one of my favorite parts of the Lord's Prayer is "Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." What are we praying for when we say that? We're basically saying that through our actions, through the love that we demonstrate as Christians, through the self-sacrificial love that we demonstrate based on what the love that Jesus demonstrated for us, that's transformative.
Right.
That helps us move toward the goal of God's will not being something restricted just to heaven, but God's will being something that's enacted on the earth, right?
Right.
That this is, so there's a real practical aspect to that, and being reminded every time we pray of that, right? That what we do is part of the dawning of that new kingdom, and we can participate in that. Prayer takes on a whole different kind of perspective when you start
Exactly.
thinking about it that way. Yeah.
So, Scott, we've exhausted this. We've come to the end. I just want to emphasize for the listeners, we have done a lot of bashing of prayer. If your idea that prayer is about getting stuff, about getting results, about coercing God, forcing His hand, That's not what prayer is meant to be. I'll say that because that's just what the statistics show. That just doesn't work. Those
Right.
kinds of prayers just do not work. If they're all about
Right.
getting stuff, getting results, and forcing God's hand, that's not what it's about. But rather, prayer is an introspective, meditative, self-exploratory discipline in which you are looking for how God wants you how you can be the solution in that prayer. How can you help the sick person, the starving people?
Absolutely. I think it's important that we, like you already mentioned, but just to, underline it again, I guess, that what we've done in this episode is to deconstruct a particular aspect of a popular notion of what prayer is. That's what we've deconstructed. We're not attacking prayer in capitals. What we're saying is that we have Christian circles, much of prayer is really superstition.
Right.
And really misleading, and can lead to manipulation and disappointment. But that's really not what prayer is supposed to be. That's not why we're told over and over to pray. And we need to now kind of reconstruct prayer around the idea of, like you're saying, introspection and even worship. There's an aspect of prayer that is also worship and thankfulness and all these things that do make us healthier individuals and more effective individuals in the world.
Okay, that's the end of this episode. Next week, we're going to talk about another spiritual practice, a fairly strange and maybe even uncomfortable topic for some, speaking in tongues. I know for many recovering evangelicals, including myself, this is a somewhat embarrassing part of our past. So it could be fun. It's certainly going to be strange. And with that, I want to thank you all for listening.
Yes, and hopefully people will find this helpful.
See you next week. Bye for now.
Bye.
You've been listening to Recovering Evangelicals with your hosts, Luke Jansen and Scott Dyer. Send your comments and suggestions for new episodes to lukejjansen@gmail.com. Join our private discussion group on Facebook by searching for the Recovering Evangelicals podcast group. Look for the logo that you always see at your favorite podcast catcher and ask to be let in. Subscribe to lukejjansen.wordpress.com if you want to get advanced releases and group posts. Or browse through our archive for a full listing of all our previous episodes. And please help the podcast by sharing with a friend and leaving a review at your favorite podcast catcher.